Hello. Welcome to my channel Touching Stories. You're about to hear an amazing story about love and unexpected decisions. Enjoy watching. In big cities, someone is born and dies every day, and most residents don't give a damn. Even if it is about neighbors or work colleagues, no emotion is sometimes expected. Another thing is villages where every person is visible. Here birth is a huge celebration, but death is always a tragedy. The villagers of Lexington spent 24 hours talking about the mysterious story of Carlos. I tell you, Angelica, it was the past that did him in, Sarah whispered excitedly. A commission will come to our village, and the entrance to this place will be closed forever. You'll say that, Angelica replied. Sometimes her best friend's fantasies went beyond the ordinary. She just wanted to gossip, but Angelica was in grief. Together with Carlos, she buried not only a handsome guy, but also her hopes for a better future. It was doubly frustrating that she had to keep her emotions in check. No one in the whole village knew about their love, only guessed. Carlos died strangely and unexpectedly. Yesterday he lived, and today he's lying in a coffin. Thankfully, the guy became a military man, and therefore longed to look for a ceremonial costume. He did not have to put on a ceremonial uniform. At the end of the 80s, all over the United States again began to open churches, and in the village of Courome also appeared its own parish. It turned out that the barn, where previously stored grain, was a pre-revolutionary church. Angelica had always suspected that this high-ceilinged building had not been built for the collective farm. She liked it here very much, quiet, peaceful. She could give Carlos a dignified last farewell. The young priest conducted the first funeral service in his life. As if alive, Angelica whispered, looking at Carlos, swallowing her tears. He really did look too good for a dead man. In the semi-darkness of the church, Carlos seemed to be dozing. Wake him up and he would get up and walk. It made Angelica both sad and scared. Carlos would not wake up. He would not come to her, would not hug and kiss her. So no one in the whole village will know about their secret love, which they hid from everyone. So she won't take his surname, as they both wanted, and his children won't get his patronymic. There's no one left for him, Sarah sighed. No daddy, no mommy. And a year ago his grandmother left, too. What I'm thinking, Angelica, maybe it's a good thing. So now we would be telling his parents, his relatives, what kind of man we lost. But this way it's fine. We just said goodbye and that's it. Oh, Carlos, victim of the government. He was the only young man in the village to make it. Almost. He went into the army at 18, and when he was demobilized, he entered a military school. He didn't say where and who he was studying for. Only Angelica knew the truth, and that was a big secret. She was the only one Carlos trusted, and even then only a little. On vacations, he came to his native village. In a beautiful uniform with epaulets. Aunt Mady, who was like a mother to him, moved into his house. I wonder if she'll get the house now. And he didn't drink and didn't smoke, and he was a hard worker. Sarah continued to enumerate his virtues. Did not bully, always calm, but very self-confident. You can feel the inner core, right? What a guy to leave. These words made Angelica feel even more offended. Carlos had promised to give her his heart every time he came to visit. And now here it was. When she heard about the inner core, Angelica started to blush, but then she realized what her friend meant. The villagers were not yet accustomed to freedom of religion, and therefore they were reluctant to go to church. They passed by as if they were passing by and baptized furtively. 3 men stood silently beside the priest who was reading the funeral prayer. They were all handsome and tall, 2 older and 1 quite young. And though they were dressed in civilian clothes, the outlines of their epaulets were imprinted on their powerful shoulders. Probably they came for their colleague, who had gone on a summer vacation so unsuccessfully. Farewell, citizens. The coffin with the body will leave in 5 minutes, said one of them. A young man with a handsome mustache, loudly, when the priest had finished reading the prayer. The church had become completely dark. Hurry up and say goodbye, or we'll have to travel in the dark. Only a few people came to say goodbye to Carlos. Except Angelica and Sarah, old men from the village who never miss a funeral. The girls were afraid to approach the dead man. In their village, young men had never died in their memory. The grandmother was shedding bitter tears looking at the boy in the coffin. "Why did you leave?" she asked through her sobs, though she knew the answer to that question. The whole village knew. "Drowned in the river," answered the man without a uniform. "Fate is such a capricious thing." "Well, Grandma, have you said goodbye?" Indeed, not 5 minutes later. The ritual was over. The young priest Jim wiped the sweat from his forehead. No one began to make fiery speeches at the coffin yet. That was not the custom here. Since the sacrament was held in the church, none of the villagers dared to commemorate the lad with a shot of vodka. Mark, Robbie, Dylan, and the others stood outside the fence and smoked. They couldn't stand Carlos, and for some reason the military had forbidden them to go near the coffin. Still, the village boys were curious about what was going on, and they were also curious about Sarah and Angelica. Mark even smiled furtively at her, though it was inappropriate at a funeral. After Carlos's co-workers had closed the lid and carried the coffin into the big bus, Angelica plucked up her courage and approached them. "Tell me, please," the girl asked, "where will his grave be?" "Why do you want to know?" a young guy with a mustache asked. "Don't worry, beautiful. We'll bury him in the best way, with honors." "I loved him," replied Angelica. "I wish I knew where the grave is. To come sometimes, to put flowers, and you leave your phone number." "We'll call you back and tell you," the guy replied. "Carlos, you see, all guarantees apply." He showed himself very much during his conscription and during his studies. "Well, I can't say more than that. Goodbye, beautiful, but don't miss him." Angelica left her neighbor's phone number on a scrap of paper, but she never received a call from the mysterious men. Either the neighbor didn't tell her, or she listened. A couple of times Angelica wrote letters to the Ministry of Defense to tell her the place of defense, to tell her the place of burial, without success. And then everything went badly, and there was no one to ask, and the worry in her life increased. She did get married, gave birth to 3 children, but she did not feel happy. "Oh, Carlos," she whispered when no one could see her. "He left so early, and where to?" And now, losing her strength at the age of 55, she was still shedding tears for her beloved. Half sitting on the cushions, she drank tea, carefully placed by Julia's eldest daughter. And while the drink in the mug became less and less, she realized that her strength was leaving her forever. It was frightening. At this point, she would have preferred to drink her signature cherry-pitted liqueur, but for some reason Julia felt sorry for her mother. "Mom, you have blood pressure," her daughter said. "You need to think about your health. When you get well, then we'll drink Naluka and cold brew." Angelica wanted to tell Julia that it was too late. That health is like an apple or pear tree, who is written on the fate to die young. No matter how grafted, no matter how much care, nothing will not help. And Angelica didn't know any doctors until she was 50. She herself carried heavy stones and pulled sacks of potatoes. And then she got sick and nothing helped. "I wanted to drink Nalavodka for the last time before I died, but I had no strength to call my daughter and ask her to pour 15 drops. Her throat was dry. She could not speak louder than a whisper out of fear. No one would hear. And when the tea in the cup ran out, Angelica's hand fell limply to the pillow. For a while longer, she saw and heard everything, realizing that she was dying. But there was nothing she could do about it. Angelica knew that at such a moment she should say something clever and important. But as it turned out, there was no one around to hear. So she just whispered into the void, "I'm dying alone, but I feel you near me, my love." And she was gone. How Carlos drowned, who found his body, is a mystery covered in darkness. Everyone knew he was an excellent swimmer because the agile guy could dive for an hour to the bottom of a cold lake and get crayfish. Carlos cooked them marvelously. He immediately boiled them in a cauldron with markushka, garlic, and dill, which he carefully folded in a cloth. It was so tasty that it was delicious. Just a week before his strange death, he went with Angelica to the local river with crystal clear water. The young man caught crayfish, and Angelica made a fire. Then they swam together, kissed and laughed from their young love, the very first and purest. The girl wanted to take a bottle of moonshine with her, but Carlos strictly forbade it. And now she even liked that they were intoxicated only with love and a beautiful summer evening. With a long stick, the guy took out boiled crayfish from the boiling water and threw them on the grass. Then he showed me how to clean the claws to get to the meat. I learned that in the army, he said. You're always hungry in the army. You just think about where to eat and what to eat. Once we were sent to some exercises and stood knee-deep in water for half a day. I saw crayfish coming, so I picked them up, boiled them up. They were delicious. Carlos wasn't being dishonest. It must be that the nutritional standards in the army were calculated correctly, and a soldier had to consume exactly as much food as he was given. The trouble was that not everything that was listed in the documents reached the private's table, first of all, and secondly, the young, growing body demanded increased nutrition. Carlos was 190 centimeters tall, and in the shoulders he was extremely broad. He could lift Angelica in his arms and toss her up as if she were a child. Once we were thrown into the forest for training for a day, he told her after demobilization about the culinary army masterpieces. All we had was a shovel, a bayonet knife, and a rifle. The trenches, then, must be dug right on the edge of the forest. So me and my boys gathered such hogs, and I managed to set a trap for a hare. He ran away. But how could he run away from me, hungry? And with rapture he told about the roast of wild hare with mushrooms. Listening to these stories, Angelica could not help but respect her fellow villager. He does not complain, does not whine and lament, but just lives. She imagined herself in his place, hungry in the forest. Would she have the courage to catch a hare with her bare hands? Don't they feed you in the army? She asked him. They do, Carlos answered. And if you go on exercises, they give you soup rations. What are dry rations? Angelica wondered. Although there was a school and a radio in the village, and in the evenings she watched TV, she did not know many things. But she was an optimist. And when Carlos said that unfamiliar word dry rations, she immediately imagined food that only needed water added to it. Throw the bag in water for half an hour, and it becomes chicken. Or borscht. Well, dry rations, Carlos explained. Canned food like porridge with meat, galettes, bread. So why did you go to the hare? Angelica wondered. She was glad she hadn't told her beau, as she imagined the dry rations would have laughed at her. A country girl. Why? Carlos was surprised. Hare is delicious, tastier than canned food. Then we mixed it with mushrooms for a dish. Like in Moscow restaurants, Angelica knew Carlos was studying. Even though he had become a scholar, he still treated her kindly. He promised to marry her, to take her with him. And that memorable evening, lying on his lap, she looked up at the sky and imagined their future life. He, as a military man, would be given an apartment. Not the biggest 3 or 4 rooms, no more. To have a toilet right in the apartment and hot water from the tap. So that if you want to drink tea or boil soup, you don't have to go to the column or to the well. And with radiators that will warm by themselves in winter. Angelica, of course, liked to stoke the furnace, but chopping wood was tedious. Then they kissed again, and Carlos didn't do it the way they did in the village. Angelica kept silent about the fact that from time to time she kissed Mark, the local bully. Why does Carlos need to know? She thought. We'll move to California anyway, and we'll never go back to our home village. I have something to say to you, Angelica, said the beau that evening and sighed bitterly. What to say? Asked the girl, and began to worry that there, in the northern capital, he has another only better, prettier, and without her village accent. "You need to know something," the young military man began, but immediately grabbed himself by the hand. He stopped talking. "What is it, Carlos?" Angelica asked. "Well, that I love you. That I love you very much. We're going to get married and go to New York. You'll be an officer's wife." Until her last days, Angelica felt that Carlos had kept something from her. He'd been deceitful or insincere. Or maybe he really wanted to reveal some important secret that made him quit life. Alas, there was no one to ask. Carlos drowned. Word of it traveled fast through the village, but no one ever found out the details. As if out of nowhere, 3 military men, who weren't even wearing uniforms, appeared and took the body away. Angelica only had time to say goodbye. There was nothing left to remember, not even a photograph. Funerals in the countryside are always a hassle. In Washington or New York, a person just passes away as inconsolable relatives immediately begin to call funeral agents. It feels as if they can see in advance who will pass away and when. Along with condolences, the agents offer coffins, wreaths, monuments, and everything else that funerals cannot do without. In the village, even these simple things are in short supply. "Why didn't you call the priest?" Sarah, a childhood friend, asked through sobs. Like Angelica, she never realized her youthful dream of leaving the village for the city. At first she was afraid, and then there was nowhere else to go. Angelica wanted to take communion before she died. "How did I know she would die?" the tractor driver asked. She was only 55 years old. The widower was lying. He didn't like Jim's father, and even if Angelica had asked him, he wouldn't have called him here. He would have to drive him, offer him tea and coffee, smile at him. No smoking. He still couldn't get used to the idea that Angelica, his hope and support, had gone so quickly and easily. Now Mark was scratching his head. Where could he find so much money to spend his wife's last journey with dignity? Yes. The last few years they fought a lot. As soon as the children grew up and out of the nest, she did not give him a life, neither with friends in the bathhouse to sit in the bath, nor to the favorite woman in the neighboring village to go to tea. But now she was gone, and it was necessary to collect her in a dignified way. "Papa," said Julia, the eldest daughter, "we've got to go into town right away and call Father Jim to prepare the funeral." "Why?" Mark asked. "Well, with Jim, it's understandable, but why go to town?" "Why?" The girl was indignant. "You've gone completely wild, Dad. To go to the district office to get a coffin. You need a coffin and everything else." "What else?" Mark asked sternly. He hated it when women tried to boss him around. "How should I know?" Julia answered, "as if I buried my mother every day," and sobbed. Mark immediately felt guilty, waved, and went to his friend Dylan. He was the only one in the village who had a minibus. He took out his stash of 40,000, hidden from his wife. Would it be enough for the funeral or not? He decided not to take Julia with him, though she, a woman of science, could be useful. "We'll deal with it without the women," Mark said flatly. "It's a bumpy road. You'll get sick. You'd better collect for the wake. Go around the houses." The road really left much to be desired. One good thing: July was dry, so the road to the city did not sprawl, as it often happens in summer. The old Volkswagen rocked like a boat, but the experienced tractor driver couldn't help it. Together with Dylan, they came to town. Went to the district council, where the newly widowed widower had to fill in a whole stack of documents by hand. "I haven't written so much since high school." He was indignant, but the woman in one window was adamant. And if Mark made a mistake or simply wrote illegibly, she made him start over. "Ma'am," she shouted, "this is a multifunctional center. One window, for fuck's sake. Get your shit together and write it down as required." All right, nodded the tractor driver. He really felt uncomfortable. When had he last picked up a pen? He couldn't even remember. It was especially hard for him to copy out the numbers from his wife's passport. Looking at the sample for some reason, the tractor driver could not rewrite the original text without mistakes. It took him an hour. "Are you done with your penmanship?" Dylan, a fellow villager, asked when the papers finally gave way. Mark wanted to be indignant that on a day like this he could do without the jokes. But then he decided to keep silent and not fight. He couldn't find a second van. Another portion of criticism Mark had to listen to in the ritual store. It turns out that coffins come in different sizes and salesmen can't read minds. I had to call Julia to run to the neighbor's house to get a tape measure and measure my mom. Finally, that was over too. Then, again, we had to go to the administration, but already in the village. Then Mark was again forced to write by hand a request for a place in the cemetery. After a pile of papers in one window, he coped with it relatively easily. The clever official kept hinting that it was necessary to assist the local budget. But the widower pretended to be deaf to his words. "Here's another price, look at the price," said the official. "Coffins, wreaths, crosses, all at a discount." Mark looked at the paper and grumbled. He had already bought everything he needed much cheaper. But he decided not to quarrel with this weirdo. After all, he needed a place in the cemetery urgently, and he needed a bigger one for 4 people, so that when his term was up, the girls wouldn't have to waste their time. "So we already got everything," Mark said. "We don't need anything else, and there's no money to pay." "Do you have transportation?" the official asked. "I can offer a car." "I can remove the seats," said Dylan. "What's the use? I've driven a lot of things in my bus." "Oh, I'm sorry, Mark." They didn't get back to Lexington until late afternoon. 40,000 was just enough, plus Lyosha had to pay for the diesel. They made a handshake that they'd settle up later. Mark had enough unaccounted fuel anyway. All they had to do was to go to the barn and siphon some from the barrel. They decided not to do that today, but to go to rest. The morning cares had worn them both out. Mark, the tractor driver, felt as if he had spent the whole year traveling. When he got home, he wanted to call his wife to warm the soup and put a bottle on the table. But then he remembered that no matter what you call, you won't be able to get through. Last week's Angelica gave up a lot. She could hardly get out of bed, but she continued to cook. She would sit on a chair in the kitchen, put a table in front of her, and start making cutlets, or chop vegetables. She had this idea that a woman, even lying on her deathbed, should feed her man to the full. Of course, she couldn't do much. Julia was helping her. Her eldest daughter wasn't home, and neither were the others. Mark went into the kitchen of their spacious farmhouse, found a pot of soup that his wife had cooked the day before, heated it up. He poured a large bowl and began to sip it. As if by magic, a bottle of vodka appeared in front of him. He didn't even remember when he had taken it, but he had obviously been preparing for this moment. The glass fogged up. The bottle was waiting for its time in the refrigerator. He poured a shot, drank it, ate some rye, and cried bitterly, realizing that Angelica was gone and there was no bringing her back. On the 7th day, after Carlos's death, Angelica's mood became completely disgusting. She finally realized that she not only could not live without her military man, but also did not want to. That she loved him with all her heart, and now without his laughter, without his culinary masterpieces, the world was not sweet to her. Going to work at the collective farm, where she worked as a calf, became harder and harder. She wanted to drink a bottle of moonshine in one gulp and disappear. "Oh, Angelica, Angelica," said Sarah, watching her friend's condition. "That's how you've fallen. How can I help you?" Angelica was silent. There was no cure for her melancholy in the world. She desperately, terribly needed to talk to Carlos. Even though he was gone, Angelica knew that the boundary between the world of the living and the dead was elusive. And if you wanted to communicate, you could. You either have to find a fortune teller or fall asleep properly. Then he will appear. But she didn't want to tell her friend about it for fear of hearing another fantasy. How could Carlos drown? Angelique lamented a week after his funeral. Such a swimmer, he dived and held his breath for long periods of time. Why did he go swimming alone? I'll tell you, Sarah said. She knew all the rumors not only from her village, but also from the surrounding villages, so she could easily find an explanation for any event. Do you know that mermaids have settled on our cold river? Mermaids? Angelica was surprised. Of course she had heard of such things. But she could not think that her friend seriously believed in such miracles. Yes, whispered Sarah. When a handsome young man swims naked in the river, she's there. Under the guise of a city girl with makeup, she starts a conversation, makes him swim after her, and then she grabs, you know what organ, and drags him to the bottom. And then no young and handsome guy can swim out. No way, Angelica said. Sarah so colorfully described and showed this process that the picture involuntarily appeared in front of the girl's face. She had to shake her head to drive away the obsession. She could, she went on with gusto. Yes, it can. What does that tell you? That Carlos wasn't so good and honorable. He was dragged to the bottom by a mermaid for his organ. Jacob, our horse breeder, says they took him as a witness when those guys were writing some paperwork. Maybe as a witness, Angelica asked. She hardly understood the meaning of the word, of course, but at least she knew how to pronounce it correctly. Well, what difference does it make, whether you're understood or understood? Sarah shrugged her shoulders. Anyway, he wasn't even allowed to look at Carlos. He was lying under a white sheet, our drowned man. These men only lifted the cloth a little. Do you recognize him? They didn't show anything else. Do you know why they forbade it? No, answered Angelica honestly. Because he was all kissed, whispered Sarah. Excited. The mermaid put those hickeys on him. Like Mark did to you then, remember? Angelica blushed. The local tractor driver who hit on her in Carlos's absence was indeed sometimes too passionate. But Angelica was not one to talk about that out loud. Once again, she thought about the fact that she could never get the military back, and she felt sad again. Mermaids, you say? She asked to keep the conversation going. In fact, her friend was boring her. Definitely mermaids, Sarah blurted out. It's such a secret design. I'm telling you, it's like a pass. Mermaids are secret weapons. You just don't tell anyone, or you and I might get the same thing. Such an explanation was not only stupid, but also did not help Angelica to cope with her moping. Even the hard work of the calf did not help her to see the world as anything but black colors. She continued to feed the young stock with milk, to make additives in the feed, but she did it as if on autopilot. The chief zootechnician again demanded from her Stakhanovite labor, and as always profanely, Angelica, damn you on your knee, shouted the head of the entire dairy shop. Why are you sleeping on the go? Get to work before I flog you. The native collective farm was the last one to show signs of life in the whole district. She bought milking machines from abroad, ordered supplements from everywhere, and while neighboring farms were dying and milk did not reach the factory, their collective farm continued to grow and properly feed the workers. And yet Angelica was both bored and sad here. Both Washington and California were floating away from her with Carlos. Not everyone noticed her despondency, though. Mark, for instance, was still paying attention to her. He smiled a little goofy, but he was sincere. He'd come into her cough a couple times and hold her when no one else was around. He kissed her without even asking permission. But Angelica still didn't mind. Listen, Angelica, he said a week after Vasia's death. I've done some renovations. I want to show you. Oh, Mark, the girl waved her hand. You've done it and done it. What do I care? No, come and have a look. He wouldn't stop. My house is a beauty now. I've got everything, but I'm missing a mistress. Mark was young, 2 years younger than Angelica, just a child. He didn't go to the army. They didn't take him for health reasons, so in the village they jokingly called him defective. But Mark did not get upset. He learned to be a tractor driver, and now he worked 2 shifts in the collective farm. It is not known what the doctors wrote to him, but the young man had a lot of strength, and the most important thing was that he had some kind of drive, which allowed him to turn any business into income. He would go somewhere on a collective farm tractor and return with 30 rubles in his pocket. For some reason, he chose her out of all the village girls, and he didn't want to accept the difference in age and everything else. "You're a good guy, Mark," Angelica said, "but you're just not right for me, so I will not approach and drive up," blurted out the tractor driver and blushed. Mark was clearly referring to the tractor with which he spent much of his free time. "Okay, I'll come that way," the girl gave in. "But no moonshine, okay? And you'll leave me alone later, okay?" Both Mark's father and grandfather were carpenters. They hadn't been working on the collective farm lately, but were doing endless odd jobs. There was money in their house. The whole village knew about it, but their way of life was deliberately modest, even isolated, and Mark tried to be on his own. He didn't get acquainted with their group of young people very often. In the evening, Angelica washed and changed her clothes and came to visit the tractor driver. He put on his jacket, however, right over his sweater, which made him look ridiculous. He smiled and smoked cigarettes, and the smell of strong tobacco made the girl dizzy. "Here," Mark said, showing her the outhouse. "Do you see what my father and I have built? Now it's as if I have my own private house. Come with me." Angelica saw him literally glowing with pride. The annex to the house was small, but the girl still felt a prick of envy. She is here in order to separate from her parents, need either in the city or in another collective farm. And what will they give her there? A bed in a barracks or a dormitory at best. Until you marry and give birth, you can't even think about your own house. "It's beautiful," complimented Angelica. "Did you do it yourself?" "Yes, with my father," nodded Mark. "Look, I made the bed, the table, and the chairs. They paneled the living room with planking and varnished it. It looked beautiful and fabulous, and there was the smell of fresh wood in the air, which Angelica had always liked so much. "It's good to be able to work with your hands," the girl said. "My mom and I are still waiting in line for a set." Her mother told her something about communism and socialism, but Angelica didn't really trust such stories. The chairman of the collective farm has a beautiful and nice house, and they live in a hut with freezing walls, which her grandfather built after the war. Is this communism? My mother had worked in the collective farm all her life, and for the last 8 years she had been waiting in line for a Jack wall. They had only a general idea of what it was, but they wanted to have it in their house. It must be a long wait. Mark and his parents are different. They don't wait for anything, and they don't wait in lines. They do all the work themselves. Good hands. Very beautiful, Angelica praised again. There was no one else in the house except her and Mark, so her cheeks turned crimson for some reason. Very beautiful, she repeated, not knowing what to say. That's nothing. The tractor driver waved his hand. Come on, I'll show you real civilization. This word he said with such an intonation that the girl began to laugh. What kind of civilization had he invented? But when Mark opened the last door in his annex, she didn't care. This must be what communism looks like, when a hut has a Julian toilet and bathtub. Here, Mark said, pointing to the toilet and sink. I saw it in her house and wanted to do the same. It's convenient, damn it. And the water must be cold, Angelica said pickily. She really wanted somewhere deep in her soul that this splendor turned out to be a sham. Well, Mark scratched his chin. It's not that simple. There's a bathhouse behind the wall. When the stove heats up, the water in the tank and in the sink gets warm. But you have to be careful not to burn yourself. It's more complicated with the toilet. The water flows weakly by gravity. Sometimes you have to flush it with a bucket. That's it. For some reason, Angelica was amused. She had never thought that the tractor driver was so much concerned about his own comfort. Maybe she didn't need to go to Washington or California to find her happiness. The two of them stood in that bathroom, unprecedented for the area. "Imagine, Angelica," Mark said. "Grandpa says he's going to get a washing machine. A washing machine. A washing machine. A real one. We'll be happy then, eh? Marry me, Angelica." Without waiting for an answer, the tractor driver grabbed the girl, pulled her into a bundle, and dragged her into the room. Mark and his grandfather had made a good bed. It hardly creaked at all, and that evening, for the first time that week, the girl's mood lifted. She thought that Carlos was not the only one in the world. Even in her village there were still young and handsome guys, even if they were not so educated. An experienced priest had been feeding his flock in the local church for more than 30 years. Father Jim's Sunday service was attended by people from neighboring villages, and his boisterous activity went far beyond the village. Batiushka was ready to give advice, to read a prayer from drunkenness and from wantonness, to listen to any problem. A long time ago, he had the idea to organize a children's choir, and now the 5th or 6th generation of boys and girls went to him. Father Jim was both loved and respected. He reciprocated, treating every parishioner as a relative. That's why he was so upset to see Angelica on her deathbed. The parishioner helped him in the church. She washed the windows, tinted, and renewed something. Mark was even jealous of her and Father Jim, so he hardly ever went to church. And now, standing near the coffin during the funeral service, the tractor driver crumpled from foot to foot. In earthly life, a Christian experiences a lot of pain and suffering, but the main test is death, the great sacrament of traveling to the kingdom of God. Let us pray for the departed servant of God, Angelica, and light candles in memory of her, said the bishop after reading prayers and psalm. May she find her way to the kingdom of eternal life, and may she help us, humble servants of God. From that Sarah. The villagers had only to nod at these beautiful words. The inconsolable daughters shed tears, but Mark only blinked. In his thoughts he wished that the funeral would be over soon, so that he could be alone. Then he remembered the wake, and his mood immediately soured. The whole village was whispering that Mark had brought Angelica to the grave before the deadline, that he could beat her and hurt her, but she tolerated it all, for the sake of her children, and so that no one in the village would think anything bad of them. There was a reason for it. Angelica and Mark had grown up very nice girls. Here, of course, entirely the merit of the mother, who for the sake of her daughters was ready to work from dawn to dawn. Mark's profession is in-demand tractor driver, the first man in the whole district, necessary both in winter and in summer. But over the years his love cooled down. Scandals, scolding, mutual reproaches began. Once a month, the district police officer came to them, not less. But all to no avail. A grown man cannot change and do not remake. Now Mark, standing with a candle, blamed himself. He had not told her everything, the tractor driver thought. He hadn't said goodbye in a human way. He thought she'd recover and get up, but she didn't get up. My Angelica has left me. She left me alone. Delayed remorse pained his soul, and he could not even find words for it. Now to look at his wife in the coffin, he was afraid. What if she now knew all his secrets? What if she would not show him the way, as the priest said, but take revenge? The funeral service was still not over. It seemed that not only Mark was tired, but also the other villagers who had come to say goodbye to Angelica. Suddenly the door to the church opened, and another man appeared on the threshold. Mark began to stare at him, and terror in his soul grew even stronger. At times like this, we have a duty to remain united, Father Jim had said. Angelica left behind a beautiful legacy. 3 children who came to pray for her soul. A beautiful home in which the word of God was always remembered. In her sincere labor, Angelica, the priest suddenly stopped half a word, looked at the guest, and crossed himself. His memory was excellent, so he remembered this man whom he had sung 32 years ago. and Mark staggered and collapsed to the ground in a faint. Sarah cried and was hysterical, terrified that she had gone mad. Then suddenly she rushed out the door screaming. At least 2 villagers followed her example, but they left quietly, and the guest, as if nothing had happened, went to the coffin, placed a large bouquet of carnations on Angelica's chest and crossed himself. He sighed. The batyushka once again looked at the guest and once again crossed the space in front of him with a sign. Mark was brought to his senses by smelling ammonia, from which he immediately began to cough. Dylan came closer to the mysterious guest and looked into his face. "In," said the local with a smile. "It's definitely him." "No," the man shook his head. "You have me confused with someone else. I came to my friend's funeral." Dylan froze as if struck by thunder. Him or not him? The face looked familiar. They had gone fishing together as children. But the confidence with which the man dismissed his assumption was discouraging. Was it just a vision? Only Father Jim kept his wits about him? When he saw that Mark had regained consciousness, he nodded his head to the movers, and they picked up the coffin and carried it to the van. It turned out that young Mark was as much concerned about Carlos' death as Angelica. Although he never said so, he liked the young military man very much. He looked at his uniform, his bearing, and wished he could be like him. But in the family prevailed quite different genes. Both grandfather, son, and father were short, but very stocky. "Do you believe that he drowned like that?" asked the future husband. "He swam like your whale." "I don't know," answered Angelica. "Honestly, I don't know." Immediately, she did not like Mark from the word at all. It seemed that he was losing to Carlos in everything. He says what he thinks without thinking, no manners at all. He fights with his father and grandfather, and once they had a fight. All 3 of them. Never said a nice word to her, never complimented her. But she had her good points, too. First of all, the whole family loved to work. From morning till night they were somewhere missing, but there was money in the house, and her new relatives lived very well. Secondly, they knew how to do everything, and most importantly, they wanted everything. Mark's father had gotten rich by any means necessary, and now the 3 of them were just discussing the mechanics of the automobile in their own incomprehensible male language. "I don't think Carlos could have drowned," Mark began again. He seemed to have no other topics of conversation. "Do you know why?" "No," answered Angelique. "It's impossible to drown there," Mark continued. "The bottom is flat, no snags, no whirlpools. And Carlos doesn't drink, by the way. He's probably watching his health." He made it sound like a reproach. It was not customary in the family to refuse alcohol, and for some reason they drank vodka in a glass instead of a shot glass. But it seemed to the girl at that moment that she could re-educate her future husband and keep him away from alcohol. It is only necessary to explain that vodka does not do good. And if you already drink, then a little bit, not until you fall on the ground. "Did not drink," corrected Angelica, and added meaningfully, "By the way, not such a bad habit. You remember how tall he was, don't you? That's because he didn't drink or smoke." "It's too late for me to grow up, Angelica," laughed the tractor driver. "Only if you grow wider. Maybe he's dead," Mark said, muffling his mighty voice. "Drowned." "Don't talk nonsense," answered Angelica and blushed. Her fiancé would think of such a thing. "No, why?" The tractor driver did not calm down. "Have you seen those 3 jackets?" "You mean the co-workers?" the girl asked. "Well, they came to say goodbye. Decent people, very nice." "To say goodbye? Yes, decent people." "Ugh," Mark wailed. "Drowned, taken away, and the end in the water. Carlos knew something, he knew it. I'm telling you this. I went to those 3 guys and said, 'Give me a cigarette.' And they refused me in such terms that it was embarrassing. I'm embarrassed. Can you imagine in what terms they said no?" Angelica doubted whether to sign with Mark. After all, younger than her, rough and rude. But he's handy. You don't have to ask him for anything. He'll do it all himself. Especially before the wedding, she didn't have to ask him 2 or 3 times. Angelica was at first uncomfortable that she and Mark began to have affairs, and then noticed the village girls look at her with envy, and immediately decided that the husband, tractor driver, and even with his own annex is not the worst option. Only her mother looked very battered. Usually she did not enter into any conversations with the men. She cooked, cleaned, fed the pigs. A silent and speechless woman. Only after the wedding, Angelica noticed the other side of the coin. "Are you sure you need to go to the city?" asked her father-in-law, feeling sorry for his own car. "Maybe another time you will go?" "For a checkup I need," said Angelica, already decently pregnant. What in the abdomen hurts and pulls. "Well, tomorrow we'll go," answered her father-in-law. But he wasn't going anywhere tomorrow either. Mark and his family drank her strength and health. She gave birth to 3 girls, put them on their feet, but she dried up. And up to now she didn't realize that everything inside hurt and sometimes burned with fire. It was awkward for her to ask neither Mark nor his father for help. After his joking death, Carlos easily parted with his real name, surname and past. After all, in essence, what had connected him to his home village? Only Angelica, a beautiful flower that grew in the middle of the mud. The state left him little choice, either service or love. At 23, the question of priorities was not even a question. There are plenty of girls around, and he is unlikely to receive such tempting offers. "You see," said Colonel Jacob, his Juliavnik and comrade, "there are some positions that are incompatible with family. But you won't be sorry. You'll get a new passport, a new name. You'll go abroad like you go to your grandmother's house in the country. Not everyone gets that honor. Oh, not everyone." By the 3rd year of military school, Carlos realized that to achieve something in the service, you must be ready to follow any order. Not to ask questions, not to look for excuses, but just to do at any cost. That's why, when the colonel ordered him to die, Carlos just took it in stride, especially since it wasn't a jubilant death. It was a symbolic step. The big boss said, and he really knew how to rant. After all, who's going to die? An orphan, a villager, a future collective farmer, and a failed drunkard. And who will be born? An officer of the Soviet army, a foe's terror, an excellent officer, and so Carlos became a spy. Or rather, a spy. That was the beautiful word by which Soviet officers were supposed to be called. He died not in a jubilant manner, but in a fake one. Instead of Carlos, the son of peasants, Jonathan was born, a descendant of the nobility, whose parents and grandparents had perished in the camps. He was given a new passport and forced to memorize a biography that didn't really exist. And while Carlos was learning languages, comprehending the subtleties of his new profession, a terrible thing happened. The USSR collapsed. The USSR collapsed. The Soviet army, in the ranks of which he was to take a responsible place, was gone. And for some time the young officer was in confusion. What to do now, how to live on? A high-ranking Juliavnik came to his aid again. "Here's the thing," Colonel Jacob said. "The U.S. is not going anywhere, and the U.S. is gonna get its way. So you study up, Jonathan. Get ready. And don't doubt that you and I will serve this country well. Oh, we will. You'll be proud." The experienced officer was right. Timelessness lasted for 2 or 3 years, and during this time Carlos calmly learned English and French, learned to hold his breath underwater for 4 minutes, to shoot with 2 hands, to shoot with 2 hands, to stay awake for 2 days. Then the U.S. raised its head again, and the renewed state again needed not spies, but scouts. It turns out that the bad era not only did not become a barrier to his career, but spurred it. Yesterday's military man became a diplomatic officer, a gray, unremarkable, responsible clerk, but that was only part of his image. In the endless travels across Europe, and the spy performed a variety of tasks. He had to shoot and hide from bullets, playing endless roles, trying endless roles, trying on new images and names like costume. Carlos was good at everything, and most importantly, not a single failure. How many lives he'd lived, I'd lost count. But every fairy tale has an ending. It was the same with Carlos. He noticed that after 50 years he was no longer trusted with serious tasks. All he did was have endless conversations with agents of influence, sources, and the usual fools who could tell him important information, writing reports that were much easier to send. And he waited and waited for a promotion, a new rank and a high position, especially after the anniversary of Carlos Jonathan's 55th birthday. "You are summoned to Washington," he was told at the embassy in the Federal Republic of Germany, where he had worked for the past 5 years. And in the secret report was another input. "You must report to headquarters within 5 days." The elderly scout was then unspeakably happy. Yes, it was time for him to settle down in his native country. Maybe even start a family. He should meet his old age with someone, right? At 55, Carlos felt energetic and full of vigor. As was his habit as a young man, he didn't accumulate things, so all his belongings after 5 years at the embassy fit into 2 suitcases. When the plane landed, Carlos suddenly felt a sense of elation. It seemed to him that now he was sure to get a position that would match his merits. Maybe he could even get elected as a deputy. He arrived at the hotel, shaved and washed his face, put on his best suit, and went to the headquarters. "They'll give him the general's job for sure," Carlos whispered, singing some tune he'd memorized on the plane. A spacious office, a private driver. "Finally, I'll have a decent life." How wrong he was. Carlos entered the old church, which on its way had worked as an ammunition depot and a barn. He couldn't help but stare. From an unsightly building where he had spent the last hours of his past life, it had been transformed into a work of art. Now the walls were covered with paintings and frescoes. There were icons, altars, iconostases everywhere. Everywhere gold and the smell of incense. Such beauty took his breath away as he approached the coffin. He saw her, Angelica. Of course, if he'd met her on the street, he wouldn't have recognized her. Her hair was gray, her face all wrinkled, the corners of her lips pulled down. It was as if the last years of her life she'd been upset all the time. As he approached the coffin, the man placed on her chest a bouquet of carnations he had brought with him from the big city. What kind of flowers did she like? Carlos thought to himself. I didn't really know anything about her. All that remained of the memories of 30 years ago was how they swam naked in the river and then warmed each other with their own warmth, how they cooked crayfish together, hiding their first love from the whole village. Carlos had promised to marry her 20 times, but he had cheated. His thoughts in those years flew far ahead beyond the borders of their village and even the state. It was him, Carlos heard whisper. It was definitely him. But the memories and the sight of his beloved woman in the coffin had him so hooked that the man stopped paying attention to what was happening in the church. The only thing that brought him out of his daze was a loud noise as a plain-looking man in a jacket collapsed to the ground. Carlos looked at him. Mark. He hadn't changed at all, except for a small beard. It was him, Carlos said, as if he were half asleep. Another man was pointing his finger unceremoniously in his direction. His face was familiar, but he couldn't remember his name. You have me confused with someone else, Carlos whispered angrily. I've come to say goodbye to someone I know. Is that you? The man wouldn't stop. Well, tell me you. Behave yourself in church, Carlos hissed. Show some respect for the deceased. Father Jim nodded his head approvingly. Carlos didn't recognize him. For the last time they'd seen him, he'd been a young man. It was as if time had enlarged him. He mumbled something else, made a gesture with his hand, and the movers took up the coffin. That's how his first and only love was buried quickly and secretly. The relatives accompanied the deceased, the priest said. If you're not feeling well, you can take a break. You hear that, Mark? I'm telling you to take a rest, to recover. But the inconsolable widower did not listen to him, though he was anxious to take a breath and recover a little. Once again looking at Carlos with a fixed gaze, Mark also went near the coffin and helped to carry it. The guest had the feeling that the whole village recognized him, that 32 years ago they had played the death episode too cleverly. But Carlos felt no remorse about it. He wished he'd worn a wig or disguise before going to his home village. But the lack of disguise had a certain meaning. He wanted to appear to Angelica himself as the real him. It wasn't just her death that upset him, though that was hard to accept. No, the sight of his first love had been a real blow. It was as if someone had drunk all the life out of her, and instead of the young beauty he remembered her as, she was an old woman in a coffin. Carlos exhaled bitterly. Now he would get back in his car, start the engine, put on some music and drive away. Now he would be gone for good. He would start a new life. His fifth or sixth, he had lost count. He still had a proud bearing from the service, which would definitely help him to stay alive and not to be lost. Suddenly, the former scout saw Angelica alive, young and beautiful, and became cold, and felt the floor shaky under his feet. But by an effort of will he held on. In the headquarters he was received not at all as befits a future general. The guard at the entrance checked his documents long and meticulously and made him fill out an authorization. Carlos knew that this was a kind of test. That's why, with a slight smile, brazenly fulfilled all the requirements, and even gave him a farewell salute. The chief of intelligence was in no hurry to receive him. Carlos waited in the reception area for an hour before the inspector came out. He looked at the scout who had just returned from Germany. He even looked at him with some displeasure. "What about the chief?" Carlos asked instead of greeting him. "The chief is busy," the duty officer replied. "He asked me to apologize for him. Now go to personnel. They're waiting." "What do you mean, personnel?" The scout sailed. The duty officer shrugged his shoulders. When Carlos took a step toward the chief's office, a young military man blocked the way. "Personnel first," he repeated. "I told you," the chief apologized, "but asked not to be disturbed. He's in a meeting." So after all, no one came in," said the scout. "I've been standing here for an hour." "Conference call?" answered the duty officer, without a shadow of embarrassment. They all know how to lie and not blush. "Go to personnel, Jonathan." Walking across the marble floor to the second floor, the scout suddenly felt 55 years old. His left knee ached and he felt dizzy with indignation. Although the last time Carlos had been to the headquarters more than 5 years ago, he had no trouble finding the right classes. And when he entered, he had the feeling that the personnel were already waiting for him. "The state thanks you for your impeccable service," the young major said without preamble or greeting. "Signed a secret order to send you to retirement with the rank of colonel. As a veteran of service, you have the right to choose housing of typical consumer qualities in any city in the United States." "Fired, then?" The scout smiled bitterly. "Not at all, Comrade Colonel," replied the personnel officer. "Retired. Here, read and sign." "But I'm only 55, Carlos exclaimed, accepting the papers. "I can do so much more." "The order of enlistment is signed," the major repeated, as if he hadn't heard him. "Please don't take too long to find a place to live. It will take time to draw up documents, to make repairs, to ensure security." "What if I was a teacher?" Carlos wouldn't calm down. "I would raise so many spies. Wow." "The order was signed," the major answered, as if he were a robot. Carlos felt sad. "The lieutenant general asked for you." In the next office, he had to listen to a long lecture that he was not fired, but only sent to a well-deserved rest. But as soon as the state needed Carlos, Jonathan's services again, he had to be ready to report to the nearest military enlistment office within 3 days. "Thank you for your service," said the lieutenant general. "Sign your name on the familiarization work." Carlos suddenly wanted to go back in time, to choose another fate, another life where he would have a home and a family. For some time after the fictitious death, he followed his first love. Angelica did not grieve for a long time. Quickly married, had children, and then the spy life so dragged Carlos that he forgot about his past. He forgot the name he was given at birth and many other things. Dismissal meant only one thing, an ignominious old age, even if it was not a good one. He would never be able to go abroad, not even to Egypt or Turkey, and one frank conversation with a drinking buddy could land him in jail for the rest of his life. As long as you're in the service, Colonel Jacob, his friend and Julie Abnick, had said years ago, you're essential. Once you're out of the service, you're done for. He remembered the last days of the experienced officer and would never want to repeat them. Jacob settled in at the cottage where he began to grow cucumbers and tomatoes. But then he turned to the bottle, unlike Carlos. Jonathan, the colonel, liked to drink. They buried him with honors. But who cares? No, Carlos wouldn't die. He'd go to his home village and try to make up for lost time. Father Jim said one more prayer to ward off the haze and fear. But he couldn't shake the feeling that a dead man had come to his funeral service that morning. But Tyrska sincerely believed in what he taught other people. There is heaven above them, and hell below them, and limbo and purgatory. But he had never thought that the dead could also grow old. Almighty God, whispered the priest, give me the spiritual strength to see. 32 years ago, when he was just beginning his spiritual career, 3 men approached him. One of them showed a glimpse of his ID card, but Father Jim couldn't see his name or title. They asked him to perform a funeral for a co-worker who drowned in the river. Father, only if you can, the shortest service, said one of them. We still have a long way to go. We are afraid that we won't be able to bring our comrade. We should bury him in his native village, Jim said. It's not allowed, the military man replied. He spoke in a soft voice and had an easy manner, even when he was saying bureaucratic phrases. If you don't mind, we'll bring the dead man. How could such respectable people refuse? Smiled Father Jim. If God has given life, he can call you to him at any time. Sometimes it was impossible to understand God's plan. He took the old, the young, and even children. It's always hard to bury them. That day he did not refuse the strange guests. He held one of the first rites of farewell in his spiritual career, albeit very briefly. He lit the candles and smoked the censer. In the semi-darkness of the church, it sometimes seemed to him that the dead man was breathing. Then Father Jim was still young and impressionable. More than 30 years had passed, and today he had the feeling that the dead man had come to Angelica's funeral. The family, oriented, hard-working woman, was very much to his father's liking. She never missed a single service, knew the prayers by heart, and never failed to help for the glory of God. After so many years of spiritual service, Father Jim's heart had hardened. Although he didn't want to admit it to himself, he was used to the sight of the dead. He had one peculiarity, an extremely good memory for faces. If once he saw a person, then he could always remember him. That's why the man with a bouquet of carnations who entered the church made Father Jim remember the events of 30 years ago. Was it him, or was it not him? Suspicion was heightened by the strange reaction of Mark, who fainted, and some of the other residents. Could he be singing to a living man? No, he couldn't be. It must be a trial, a test of his faith. But Tyrska had heard of such a thing before, but he didn't believe it then. Therefore, he decided not to go to bed until he would drive this vision away from him and receive enough spiritual strength from God. In the morning, my father was told that the guest had disappeared without a trace and mysteriously taking someone else's soul with him. The fog that had arisen in the coolness of the church quickly passed. It was not Angelica, but her daughter. It was because of her that Carlos couldn't leave the village as he had planned. He suddenly wanted to meet the girl, to talk to her. Fortunately, in the village, on the day of the funeral, everyone becomes at least distant relatives. So Carlos had the legal right to enter Angelica's house and even to sit at the same table. Originally, he had wanted to leave the village immediately after saying goodbye to Angelica, but now something would not let him go. Besides, he was a free man in every sense. He could even tell that he hadn't actually died 2 years ago. From his memories, he could write not a book, but an entire library. If some of the stories of his life became public, they would definitely say about him, "This is where the Hollywood drama." But the former spy did not want fame. And most of the stories that could do honor to Hollywood blockbusters, he would gladly forget. Left them in the past. His feet led him to the house. It looked nothing like it had in his youth. The tractor driver had sided it, put up a satellite dish, built a huge garage, and remodeled a lot of other things. "Are you here for the wake?" a local man asked, smiling at the stranger. "Yeah," Carlos nodded. "Why don't we warm up?" the man offered and showed the bottle behind his back. A little toast to getting to know each other. "I don't drink," answered the former scout. "Then why did you come to the wake?" The local was surprised and went into the house. The smile disappeared from his lips. At the village wake, the guests quickly forget what they gathered for. Here and now the villagers could both joke and laugh, sharing stories from their lives. Only there was no face on Mark. He sat at the head of the table and stared dumbly in front of him. When he saw Carlos, he perked up. If even from that Tsar they let go to say goodbye to a man. "Come in, Carlos," he said, turning to the guest. "Sit down." Although the drunken landlord was glad to have a guest, the rest of the villagers who could still remember the drowned man were silent. Sarah, who had also had a couple of drinks, was able to cope with her emotions this time. She was a little ashamed of her behavior in the church, from which she had run out screaming. When she looked at the guest's face again, she doubted that it was really Carlos. "I'm telling you," Sarah whispered to her friends, who were also older women. "Once every 30 years, mermaids release a drowned man so that he can come to the dear people to say something, so they let him go." Angelica's copy was sitting not far from her father. Carlos approached her, shook her hand in the European manner, and said, "My sincere condolences. The world is a little worse off without Angelica." "Thank you," Julia replied, wiping away a tear. "You sit down. Sit down. Now Nora will set you the devices." "Bah." "Sia," Mark said, unceremoniously, barely able to move his tongue. "Man, you're drunk." The scout waved away. "You have me confused with someone else. Although, I'm sorry for your loss. It's a blow to lose a wife like that." Another girl, apparently Angelica's other daughter, put a plate in front of Carlos. Jonathan put down a fork and a knife. The former scout looked at the table, and he felt sad. This is how they live, he thought. "You'll get confused, damn you." The tractor driver smiled drunkenly. "Here's what I think, Carlos. That both the living and the dead can watch each other, be close to each other, be close to each other." No. Don't think I'm a drunken redneck. I was watching TV. They were talking about it. Carlos was silent and didn't say anything. He wanted to talk to Julia, a copy of Angelica. The other villagers paid no attention to the mysterious visitor. "You, Carlos, you," repeated Mark again and tipped another shot of vodka, just huge. "If you want, I can show you my passport," Carlos said for some reason, and without waiting for an answer, pulled a document out of his jacket pocket. "Here, look, my first name is Jonathan, and my last name is even rarer." Mark stared blankly at the document, but there was no way to change his mind. The man who called himself Jonathan was as tall as Carlos, and his voice was loud, commanding. Mark wanted to say something else and ask the living dead man, but his strength left him. Leaning back in his chair, he fell into a drunken sleep and snored. "Forgive my father," the young woman said, blushing. Julia was already ashamed that she had persuaded the handsome man who had come to the funeral with a bouquet of flowers to join their table. He doesn't know how to drink, though he loves and respects it. That's all right. Carlos waved his hand. I'm often mistaken for someone else. It's just the way I look. What can you do? A man in distress. Everyone saves himself as best he can. I don't think we can judge him. The young woman was revitalized. There was something about this man, on the one hand. On the other hand, he was so different from the men she had encountered. If the guest with the beautiful name, Jonathan, had said he was German or English, she would have believed him. She thought that's what foreigners were supposed to look like. Did you know my mother well? Julia asked. I knew her well, Jonathan. Carlos nodded. Julia blushed for some reason. She wanted to know where her mom could have met this foreigner, but now she had to answer his question. 30 years old, she answered. Age is like that, you know. It's not youth anymore. As they say, it's time to have children of your own. But I'm still working with other people's children. Age is just a number, Jonathan said. It is not what is written in the passport that matters, but what is in your soul. Julia listened. The man spoke so beautifully, so well, that you had to believe him. She wanted to talk to him more, but suddenly at the wake there was a scream. Immediately after leaving the reserve, Carlos fell into despondency. He had grown so accustomed to life in Europe that he had stopped noticing the countless joys that filled it. Now he longed for a stroll down the Champs-Élysées in Paris, or a cup of coffee in an outdoor cafe in Vienna. Go to a ski resort in the Alps. Drive a Mercedes on the German Autobahn. Or go to Hungary to bathe in natural springs. Or what else is there to do in Europe? All these pleasant moments he did not appreciate at all until now. And now he regretted them, feeling a kind of phantom pain. He had developed a strange habit of talking to himself. It was as if he were giving an endless interview to a newspaper reporter. The military has one purpose: to serve the homeland, Carlos said, convincing his invisible interlocutor. It is a support, a spiritual core, and a wife. Not without reason Aristotle believed that in an ideal state, a soldier cannot have a family and children. After all, if something happens, who should the military first of all save? That's right. His country, his homeland, his region. If the invisible interlocutor did not argue with his arguments, deep in his heart, Carlos realized that he was convincing himself first of all. Yes, he was ready to defend his homeland in case of anything. But right now, he wanted so much to go to Madrid, to admire the local architecture and nature, to go to Gaudi's garden, go to Florence and stay overnight in some expensive hotel, savor fresh buns at my favorite bakery in Berlin. I love the U.S., Carlos kept telling himself. The U.S. is my homeland, my cradle, my muse. Here I spent my early years, my formation. Here I received a brilliant education. Europe for me is just an outlet and an endless battlefield for the minds and hearts of its people, a place where it's nice and comfortable to live. If I wanted to stay there, wouldn't I be able to? Easy. I just wouldn't have obeyed the order to return. I don't even exist on paper. On paper, I've been dead for over 30 years. But Carlos knew he couldn't go abroad, let alone to the European Union. He knew too much about the service from which he had been so hastily removed. Crossing the border was allowed only with the written authorization of the former chief, formally, for tourist or other purposes, and the request had to be submitted no later than 5 days before the day of travel. But Carlos knew perfectly well that no one would sign and release him. His former co-workers, unlike the invisible interlocutor, would never accept his arguments. The chief himself would not even let him on the doorstep to share this sadness with him. In the soul of the former scout settled longing, which he decided to fill with a trip to the village to his former favorite woman. Now he had to learn his homeland and build on it some simple life. After so many years in intelligence, he could not go to the place just like that, without preparation. So he wrote to a comrade who was still working and asked him to find Angelica. The sad news of her death caught him on the road. Carlos did not change his route, but only stopped in a big city to buy flowers. He didn't want to give Angelica a funeral wreath on the day of their last meeting. Now, sitting at the wake, Carlos didn't feel the stares of his fellow villagers. A professional scout. He knew how to deceive without blushing. He'd been interrogated many times by his own and others. A few meters away from Julia and Carlos, the argument about ghosts continued. Nora, Dylan's wife, is a stranger to the village of Lexington. She hadn't seen Carlos before his mysterious drowning, but her nemesis words were beginning to irritate her. Sarah was always making up tall tales, and some of them were far from harmless. So one time she spread a rumor that she saw Dylan with another woman in her arms. That day, when he was at home with his wife, that is, with Nora, preparing apples for the winter. Since that day, she had harbored a grudge against her sworn friend. She was annoyed that the fellow villager could not restrain herself and began to shout right in the church. "Is that what decent people do? You're talking nonsense, Sarah." And his car, and his jacket, Nora lamented, listening to another nonsense about ghosts. "You see, he's a Juliennial, but he doesn't eat," Sarah said caustically. "And does not eat, and does not drink. At least he would take a shot and drink. In honor of Angelica, our Angelica, do ghosts have cars like that?" Nora kept on. "Did you see the Jeep he came in? Ghosts do not need cars. They can fly." Sarah began to doubt that the mysterious stranger was Carlos. "Yes, it's similar. Eyes, forehead, hair. But he looks a little different, and as if he were taller." Still, it wasn't in her nature to admit she was wrong. Now she had to convince not only Mink with her eternal skepticism, but also herself. And so she came up with an idea that the drunken Sarah thought was brilliant. "Wow. Eh?" says. Suddenly she screamed in a wild voice. "Aha!" He turned around. "I told you it was him." "I'm so sick of you," Nora yelled back. "Can't you not yell on a day like this? Can't you put a lock on your booth?" "A booth." Sarah stood up in mock indignation. "So you're the one who called me a dog?" Nora also jumped up, and the women suddenly clashed, began to fight, throwing stools and chairs. They crashed into the table. Dishes and bottles shook, but they stood. The noise woke Mark, who looked at the fighting women with a hazy look and immediately passed out again. Carlos, engrossed in his conversation with Julia, missed the start of the argument. "Mark, I'm sorry," shouted Dylan, pulling the women apart. Other people rushed to his aid and had a hard time calming the fighting ladies. "Well, that's it. We've had our funeral. It's time to do the honors." Nora rejoiced. In the heat of the fight, she had managed to give her friend a resounding slap. It would make her cheek swell, and that was at best. As if on cue, the guests began to disperse. All of them approached Angelica's daughters and once again expressed their condolences. Only Sarah, with a huge black eye, left without saying goodbye. "Well," said Carlos, when the flow of condolences had dried up. "Where to?" Julia said fearfully. "Look, this is embarrassing. The first time a decent man came to the village, and then this. Father had too much to drink, the women fought. At least have some food for the road. You haven't touched your food." "I'm not hungry." "Listen, are you married?" Carlos suddenly asked. "Oh," she answered and waved her hand. "Don't ask. I'm neither married nor divorced. I had a husband, but he drifted away. Why don't you join us for a drink?" "I can't. I'm driving," replied the scout. "Besides, I was going to drive away." "But you have a drink with me and stay," said the girl, and smiled. "We'll make a bed for you in the bathhouse. You can have a steam." Carlos said. "Won't my father swear?" "Who's going to ask him?" Julia smiled. Don't look at me like that. I don't drink. I just feel sorry for my mom. Pity, Carlos agreed. She's still young. Did you know my mom well? The young woman asked. Julia was very afraid to repeat her mother's life. So right after high school, she went to college, and from there to the Teacher Training Institute. But working with children was not easy. When her mother became ill, Julia returned to her native home without a second thought. It had been a long time since she'd met a man, especially a good-looking one. She didn't even mind the fact that the guest was elderly. He looked as if he'd wandered into their village by accident. Why don't you stay the night? Julia asked timidly. I have a better idea, Carlos answered and smiled. Jonathan chose New York as his place of honorable exile. It was in this city that his journey into espionage or diplomacy, whoever you prefer, began. The retired military officer was given a beautiful one. Bedroom apartment with a magnificent view of the Gulf of Finland. 19th floor. From that height, New York is very beautiful. You could watch people, cars, and ships through a telescope. Now he was up again at 6 a.m, running along the waterfront, working out on the tourniquet. He found a job, but not a dusty one. He got a job as an advisor in a large trade organization. Knowing several foreign languages, he periodically wrote reports and conducted video conversations with Germans, French, Italians. They were all drawn to New York. They all wanted to trade with the U.S. That's what I was thinking, Jonathan said out loud. The destiny of our homeland is unique. They say that the U.S. should set a bad example for the world. Well, I don't know. To be honest, I never thought about it, his new companion replied. She was quite suitable for the role of an invisible interlocutor, and she agreed with everything and never argued. Julia liked New York. She also liked her new man, who, despite his age, showed an amazing desire to live and enjoy every new day. He took her to exhibitions, to the ballet and theater, gave her wonderful gifts, and he told her endless stories. Finding a job in a new place was not easy. Fortunately, Jonathan gave me some good advice. He said not to go to school or college and tried himself in a private educational center. Of course, I had to study to fit in with a new team. But the work was much easier than at school. She had no more than 8 students, and the classes themselves began in the afternoon. Often she worked directly from home. It was called remote. Unlike school, the students never tried to disrupt the class. They kept asking, trying to get the most out of it. It's nice here, Julia whispered when she woke up in the morning. And it's good with you. You're exaggerating, Jonathan smiled back. Everything is exactly as it should be. We just get used to bad things. We get used to bad coffee, to leaky roofs. The norm is pleasure. At first, the young woman's father kept calling her and demanding she come back. He yelled into the phone in a drunken voice that since her mother was dead, Julia had to take over the household, that he didn't have time to cook, do laundry, or clean. Jonathan was sympathetic to these calls and did not interfere with the conversation. What do you think? Julia asked. I should go back to my father. Remember, my dear, Jonathan replied. A real woman owes nothing to anyone. Besides, you can decide your own path in life. It's your right. The former intelligence officer liked the quiet life of a military pensioner and even began to enjoy it. He realized that all these years he had felt anxiety. He was afraid that he would be exposed, sent to prison, or killed, but now he felt calm. Julia was a copy of Angelica, not only in appearance but also in conversation. So he decided not to repeat the mistakes of his youth and not to promise anything to his new woman. Let everything go on as it was, he said with a smile. I'm not going to die. What do you mean? Julia asked. You'll understand later. Life in New York was bearable. Gradually, Jonathan accepted the idea that he would never have to leave the United States again. After all, it was possible to live here too. About 6 months after his retirement, He had already gotten used to the fact that a packet of expensive coffee might contain disgusting liquor, or Italian sausage might be sold as an inedible surrogate. Good things have a downside. You get used to them quickly, Jonathan said. Those who are most upset are those who have high expectations of life. If you don't expect anything, you'll never be disappointed. What's your point? Julia asked. She often tried to ask her man about his past, to unravel his secrets. Tell me, do you have a family? Maybe grown-up children? No, he answered. I only have you. And the rest doesn't matter, Julia. Living with a young woman had definitely done the former spy some good. He got in shape, bought fashionable clothes, and looked much younger than his years. Jonathan had completely forgotten his real name and believed that life could be restarted, even if you are over 50. But the usual harmony was shattered by just one day. From the very morning he decided to go shopping and buy something special, to surprise Julia. It had to be recognizable and memorable. He chose slowly, consulted with the consultants. After all, every woman wants a gift like this only once in her life. Jonathan already felt that he was ready for this decisive step. When he entered his apartment, he opened his mouth to say the words, but he hesitated. My darling, Julia said fearfully. She was pale as if she'd seen a ghost. You've had a call. You got a call. Called. Jonathan asked again. He couldn't understand what had frightened her so much. It was a call, all right. Wait, I have my phone on me. Former scout patted his pockets. You all have the same cell phone. Although, yes, the girl nodded, to this phone. Jonathan sighed. Julia was not a curious woman. If she opened the locker, she never asked about its contents. There was a plain red corded phone with a single button. He had never imagined that this relic would ever come to life. It seemed to him that it was just for show. So they called. What did they talk about? He asked. I wrote it down, she whispered. I'm sorry, Jonathan. Before his assignment and departure for Berlin 6 years ago, Carlos had decided to visit Colonel Jacob. He'd retired and was living out his days at the cottage, alone without his wife and children, but with a shot of vodka on the table. In the years that Carlos had not visited his comrade in Juliavnik, his dacha had become dilapidated. The colonel himself had also deteriorated. When walking, he limped on both legs, became very fat, and stopped shaving. Oh, my hearty friend. Jacob was glad to see him, and he coughed. No, I just came by, Carlos said, to see you. I don't want to drink, Comrade Colonel. You still don't drink, the retired colonel said reproachfully. Remember, a Julie Oil Soviet officer must be able to drink and not get drunk, because to look at the world sober is a dubious pleasure. Juliavnik lived in a charming gated community, right by a forest of centuries. Old pines not far from the river. Carlos had offered the retired man a walk in the neighborhood to admire the scenery, but he reacted as if his comrade was suggesting that he betray his homeland. I'm fine sitting here, he replied sharply and rudely. Go somewhere else. Here we'll melt the sauna. They'll bring us some brandy from the city. If you don't want to go to the woods, let's go fishing, Carlos said. We'll take the boat. We'll go sailing. We can't just sit here like this. Yes, we can, smiled the colonel. You can sit in one place just fine. The front doors were warped, the roof leaking. The retired military man had put basins in 2 places to collect water. But the TV in his house ran non-stop, and the heater stayed on despite the warm weather outside the window. Let's at least cook some meat, Carlos suggested. It's boring, sitting in front of the TV like this. It's not boring, you're so boring. But meat is okay, Jacob nodded. It's great with vodka. When the scout got down to his favorite pastime of cooking, his heart eased a little. It was sad to see his comrade reduced to a wreck. Or was he like that? But Carlos didn't notice. Right outside the house was a huge gazebo that hadn't been cleaned in ages. "Is there a brush in this house?" the scout asked. "At least clean the grill and the bench." Jacob waved his hand. "We'll keep this place clean." Carlos found a metal brush, broom, and cleaner in the colonel's shed anyway, and cleaned the barbecue area properly, shook the ash out of the grill, cleaned up the soot, washed the skewers. He loved cooking meat over charcoal. There was something philosophical about the process. When the heat was high enough, he put the kebab on and immediately heard an upmarket sizzle. "You're quite the cook," Jacob said, appearing out of nowhere. "I hate cooking. They bring me everything, drinks and appetizers." "Why are you sitting here alone?" Carlos asked. "You could go to Washington and get away. You should see a doctor, too." "Yeah, everybody left me." The Julianic waved his hand. "I don't want to see a doctor. It's depressing." "No, it's fine." "Is that why I joined the Scouts?" the colonel asked me. "I really wanted to see the world. All those capitalist countries I was frightened of as a child. I've seen enough. Now I can sit back at home and rest." Carlos was silent. He remembered himself, a young officer who had refused to give up his own name and surname. Then he would have gone anywhere to get out of his village. Life in the decaying West was just a nice bonus. Carlos didn't even remember leaving the colonel's house that night. How unpleasant the visit had been. His memory had simply blotted out those memories, especially when the scenery outside the window changed and he found himself in Germany, and the colonel didn't last long. After 2 strokes and complete loneliness, Jacob died in the departmental hospital. Carlos didn't attend the funeral, but he didn't want to. A call to headquarters is always exciting. If they want to criticize or punish, the big bosses will come themselves, unannounced. But if they called him to their place, it means that it's about something good, or a new rank, or a state award, or a promotion. Jonathan realized that he had been written off too soon. There must have been some circumstances he didn't know about. Most likely they were clearing the way for the young. There were enough of them now, and they were not for them now. And there were enough of them now, and they were not ready to live according to the canons of intelligence. They started not only families, which is still forgivable, but also accounts in social networks, boasted photos, did business. Did they have time for work? The call was like a balm to the soul. The gates of the departmental garage opened. If the license plates of his car were in the database, then Jonathan was expected. Yeah, he could still work. He could handle some complicated and dangerous assignment if he was trusted. He parked the car, took the elevator to the gatehouse. Now the guard, when he saw him, actually stood at attention, greeting the retired scout. Jonathan nodded to him lazily at ease. "Go to the 2nd floor," the sentry said subserviently. "They are already waiting for you there, Comrade Colonel." "Thank you," replied the scout. "Shall I escort you, Comrade Colonel?" "No, I know the way. Rest, soldier." His mood improved a little. The headquarters still made an impression with its simple but graceful luxury. Granite and marble on the walls, oak parquet on the floor, gilding and patina everywhere. Jonathan's knee had stopped hurting after he had taken up sports, and in the mornings he felt strong and energetic again. Instead of the personnel major, Jonathan was greeted by the chief, himself, smiling demurely as always. All the doors were open and the reception area was empty. That means that the conversation is very important. No deputy, that no one should hear its contents, not even his own. "Greetings," said the chief, pointing with his hand to the luxurious chairs with satin upholstery. "Have a seat, dear. I've set aside a whole hour for you, so we can discuss everything in detail." "Thank you," Jonathan replied, taking a seat. He could have reminded his boss of the offensive 6 months ago when he had not even let him in the door. But he decided not to say anything. Especially scouts know how to hide their emotions, hiding them behind a mask of interest or indifference. "The wind has changed," the chief began from afar. and the young talents on whom you left your developments could not cope with its currents. The young talents showed complete incompetence, and in some places sabotage. Illiteracy bordering on treason. Wow, nodded the spy. Who would have thought it? Just imagine. The general exhaled noisily. One such a young hero, a young smartass, damn put everyone in. All of them, the chief shouted. And where did he declassify it? 15 people were sent out. The big chief was in the habit of calling Germany by a name that had long since sunk into the summer. And the map on the chief's wall reflected wishful thinking rather than reality. What do you want me to do? Jonathan asked innocently. The homeland is in danger, the chief shouted. The homeland needs you, Jonathan. You have to take charge of one of our most important areas. We need to rebuild the agency, make new connections, but with care and caution. You'll be watched not only from the ground, but from space. Civilian satellites have been in the military service for years. Did you know that? You're the only one who can do it. Comrade General, Jonathan said. I'm ready, but only on one condition. You see, when you retired me, I settled in New York. We'll move everything, the general interrupted. A dog, a cat, aquarium fish, or a canary. Anything, interior decor. Although you yourself realize that you don't have to get used to good things. It's not about things, Jonathan sighed. I want my woman to come with me, a living person. A woman? The chief asked contemptuously. No, Colonel, that's out of the question. You'd use up all your energy on her. Have you thought about safety? You'll find a woman in the field. You remember the golden rule of scouting, don't you? Never date more than twice. Otherwise, you'll fall in love. And you should not love a woman, but your country. Jonathan was silent. Once again, the motherland was giving him an order. But was he ready to fulfill it? Was he ready to sacrifice another life? This one would be his last. After all, he would soon be 56, and he would not have another chance for love. On the other hand, the big boss, the heavyweight of intelligence, offers to start a new, important case, where the young failed, although they gave so much hope. When are you ready to move out? Chief asked. You know what, Comrade General? Jonathan answered, trying to find the right words. A belated remorse came over Mark. He was out of vodka and had no strength to get up, go to the store and buy a new bottle. Everyone had abandoned him. Everyone had abandoned him. Everyone had left. Julia ran off with the same man in an expensive car. The younger daughters didn't even want to hear from their father, wouldn't pick up the phone. Angelica. When was the last time he'd been to her grave? Mark struggled to get up and walked around the hut. Everything was falling apart. Everything needed repair. The dead woman had pointed out some faults to him, but he had waved goodbye then. Clients who needed his services as a tractor driver stopped calling 2 or 3 months ago. The money ran out. Oh, Mark. There was Evan, the village drunk, a frequent visitor to his house. How about a small one? Not for drinking, for healing. Go away, Mark waved his hand. Where are you going? Evan was surprised. Honey, let's have a drink. Go away, I said. The tractor driver shouted. He put on his boots and jacket and walked forward with a stiff gait. He didn't lock the doors to the house. Anyway, for 6 months of longing, he had drunk everything he could sell. Only the tractor remained, though nobody had started it for a long time. Mark walked through the village of Lexington, and at this time of year it lived up to its name. Grey, dirty streets, gnarled fences, abandoned houses. Once it had been a thriving village with life everywhere, but now it looked just like Mark. Grimy, unwashed, unwanted. The tractor driver walked resolutely past the store, even though they could have loaned him a bottle for the old memory, and even a whole case. Mark's reputation was good. He moved on. Finally, the church showed up. The very place he had so carefully avoided for years. The military wouldn't let Carlos go to the funeral. And then he didn't like Father Jim, who was competing with him for Angelica's attention. But right now, the tractor driver wanted nothing more than to be saved. "What day is today?" Mark asked aloud. He had long since lost count and hadn't looked at the calendar. Fortunately, the door to the church was open. It's nice inside, not warm or hot, candles burning. Father Jim is standing at the altar reciting a prayer. When he heard the sound of the door opening, he turned around. "Mark," he said cheerfully. "Come in. I had a feeling you'd come." Father Mark asked, coming closer. "Listen, it's teach me how to pray, eh? Teach me? Here. Look," Father Jim said calmly. "The fingers should be folded like this. Repeat after me." The drive from Washington to New York took the rest of the day. Jonathan did not stop. He drove forward as if he were afraid of losing something. He dialed Julia 3 times along the way, but she didn't answer. She wouldn't pick up her phone. So he sped up, accelerating to a speed that was unseemly. Thankfully, the car allowed a certain amount of freedom on the road. Parked in front of the house. Like a young man, he jumped out of the car and rushed to the entrance. I ran past the old lady concierge when I heard her in the back. The front elevator was out of order, but they promised to repair it within 2 hours. Oh, that praised St. Petersburg politeness. The freight elevator was also out of order. To use it, you had to call the manager in advance. Jonathan ran up the stairs to his 19th floor. As the stairs went up, he felt his age more and more. He was already 55. He rushed to the door out of breath. It was open even though he'd asked Julia 100 times to close it. This time, it was even better. "Julia," he said in a broken voice. "Julia, why are..." Not answering. She tore herself away from the laptop as she was just conducting an online class. Taking her iPhone in her hand, she looked at it. "Oh, I'm sorry." My cheeks immediately turned red. "Kids, 5-minute recess," announced to the students. "Sorry, I had that lever down. I didn't hear you." "Never mind," Jonathan said, pulling a box out of his pocket. "I have something to offer you, Julia. Something I think is important." At that moment, in spite of his eloquence, he could not find the words. He simply handed her the ring, which she immediately took out of the box and put on her finger. She admired the stone. "Wow," smiled the young woman. "These are gifts?" "Don't say yes right away," Jonathan asked with a smile. "Think it over." "What is there to think about?" Julia whispered. "I've waited my whole life for you, my love." "My answer is yes.